British Literature from Renaissance to the Present Day at Tallinn University and your instructor, Dr. Julia Kuznetsky. This lecture introduces the writings of David Herbert Lawrence. If we compare D.H. Lawrence to the other high modernists, we can say that the comparison is that of the opposites. If Joyce and Eliot engaged in stylistic experiments and showed a firm allegiance to the European cultural tradition, then Lawrence made no stylistic experiments and was writing in a beautiful and carefully planned prose. One of his main topics was a self free from historical, social, and moral ties. Lawrence himself was of the opinion that Joyce, for instance, while claiming originality, was in fact rewriting the old mythological and biblical stories with a stress on the coarse. So Lawrence decided to do something different. He reflects the mood of his generation, but in a different way than his contemporaries do. If Joyce was writing of a spiritual and moral death, as is reflected in the title of his short story, The Dead, and Eliot was reproducing the post-war wasteland in his poem of the same title, and also in another poem, Hollow Men, representing what men felt after the First World War, then Lawrence took a very different turn, and as he says in Lady Chatterley's Lover, ours is essentially a tragic age, so we refuse to take it tragically. For Lawrence, life represented the truth. He considered himself the writer of truth. These claims were made by Joyce as well, but again in a different way, because during the time of modernism, everything was considered relative, including truth. It is quite justifiable that each writer had his own idea of it. We can see the idea of truth in Lawrence's aesthetic. Lawrence was essentially a rural writer. His father was a barely literate coal miner and his mother a former teacher of aesthetic ambitions. Lawrence was born in a Nottinghamshire mining village, so he didn't come from upper classes. And in his writings, he insistently rejected civilization, which for him represented the dirty industry and spreading towns. He also had a derision for middle-class education, polite society as he called it, to which he never belonged nor could belong. He despised that society for the emptiness of the mind and thought that trust should be put in feelings above intellect. The purpose of art for him was to learn something about himself, one's feelings, one's inner world. In a letter to Aldous Huxley, he described his aesthetic platform as art for my sake. He also criticized modern civilization and held that education of reason was happening at the disregard of feelings. Modern man became ignorant of feelings, the body, the inner truth as he saw it. Modern social animal is suppressed by machinery, ignorant of one's natural instincts. So by that, of course, he meant what was termed during modernism as coming from psychoanalysis, the superego. So this led to the unhappy, empty, frustrated, and sterile world in which there was no harmony between men and women. And that problem troubled many of the modernists. So if T.S. Eliot portrays the situation, then Lawrence, we can say, seeks alternatives. And he writes of the escape into the world of nature and the unconscious. He believed that man is inseparably bound to non-organic nature. But modern man has lost this bond, and that is due to society, the superego. As his ideal, he saw the wholeness and balance in what he saw as primitive civilizations, that is Mexican Indians, American Indians, and the Etruscans. The purpose of the novel, as he saw it, was to recultivate emotions and help to restore the lost balance. As we can see, Lawrence was influenced by the philosophies that were instrumental for the development of modernism, including his idea of modernism. First of all, these are the ideas of Henri Bergson about the primacy of emotions over intellect and learning through direct experience and intuition. A very important influence were the ideas of Sigmund Freud about the role of the unconscious. He got those ideas from Frieda Richthofen or Frieda Weekly, the German wife of his old professor, who later became his own wife, Frieda Lawrence. They had a stormy relationship, and she enlightened him on the ideas of Freud. We can see the Freudian influence in his interest in the unconscious, and thus we can say that Lawrence's modernism consisted not in style but in ideas. So the Freudian influence then is in his interest in the unconscious, and an important theme for him was sex. As he said, I want men and women to think sex fully, completely, honestly and cleanly. And in his essay, Why the Novel Matters, he's also said, I'm man alive. So that for him meant being alive. His interest in the unconscious also manifested itself in his turning to depiction of various complexes in his writings, especially the Oedipus complex, that is the topic for his novel Sons and Lovers, that is largely autobiographical. He also wrote of freakish workings of primary emotions and sufferings brought upon the lovers by the cruel social law. That is his idea clearly of the superego. And also of their own behavior, the inner restrictions that they impose on themselves, that is the working of the superego, the pressuring of the ego to behave in a certain way. And that results in conflicting wills of the lovers and in relationships in which love and hatred go hand in hand. So, and the important theme is sex. Due to those interests in those topics, Lawrence had problems with reception. His novel The Rainbow was banned 1 month after publication for indecency. There he writes of Ursula and her doomed love for a British soldier of Polish origin. That happens at the end, and Ursula is believed to be modeled on Lawrence's own wife, Frida. She is kind of in a cage of post-Victorian prejudice, the ugly effect of civilization, in contrast with his contemporary's fascination with urban life and its fast tempo. Lawrence is insistently rural and nature-bound. So Ursula's personal epiphany at the end is also bound to this realization of her connection with nature. She saw in the rainbow the earth's new architecture, the old brittle corruption of houses and factories swept away, the world built up in a living fabric of truth, fitting to the overarching heaven. So truth for him is the truth of the body, the truth of sex. And we can see that also in his paintings. He tried his hand in art in the Naivist style. In this painting The Holy Family, we can see a reference to the Holy Family of Mary, Joseph and St. Anne. But clearly there is a very bodily harmony, and we can see the mother, who might allude to biblical Mary's mother, St. Anne, or Lawrence's own controlling mother, who is an invisible presence in his love affairs and his writings. But the Holy Family that is about to reproduce the Savior of the world, the Messiah, is engaged in very, very bodily affection. His art was not welcome by the still conservative society, enraged enough by Matisse and Picasso coming from the continent. His 1929 exhibition at Warren Gallery, London, caused an outrage upon decency, and the whole collection was withdrawn and the gallery was closed, which called for an appeal from the Bloomsbury Group and in general stirred artistic circles outraged by restrictions of freedom. As we can see, Lawrence's relationship with society was difficult. When the First World War started, they entered a conflict with the authorities because of Frida's German origin and because they had spent some time in Germany, and it was believed that Lawrence was probably spying for the German state. They were even forced to relocate from their house on the coast under the suspicion that they could be sending signals to German submarines from there. When Lady Chatterley's Lover was published in 1928, it was banned and tried under Obscene Publications Act. And it was not until 1966 when the full text of Lady Chatterley's Lover was published in Penguin Books, which is considered as one of the key events in the sexual revolution and as important for the 1960s as the songs of the Beatles.